Welcome, fearless viewers, to another chilling tale from our realm of horror. Tonight, we delve into the darkest corners of the human psyche, where shadows lurk and fear reigns supreme. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Help us reach our next milestone of 800 subscribers, as we continue to uncover spine-tingling stories that will haunt your dreams. Now, brace yourself, as the journey into the unknown begins. I have two boys. And this happened when they were 10 and 11 years old. They were always full of energy, and they loved being outdoors. In the summer, they decided they wanted to camp out in our backyard, something I used to do with them when they were younger. They had done it with me before, but this time they invited one of their friends from the neighborhood. We set up the tent in the corner of the yard, close to the fence. I helped him with the tent poles and made sure they had enough blankets and pillows to keep warm, even if a night got chilly. They had their flashlights, snacks, and some games. They were excited and couldn't wait for the sun to go down. As the evening went on, I could hear them laughing and talking from inside the house, and made me smile to see them having such a good time. I checked on them a few times, bringing out some extra snacks and reminding them to keep the noise down as it got later. Around 10 o'clock, I told them to settle down and try to get some sleep. They reluctantly agreed, but I knew they'd probably stay up talking for a while longer. It was just before midnight when I started getting ready for bed myself. It was quiet in our neighborhood, but I could still faintly hear the boys chatting in their tent. I checked the back door to make sure that it was unlocked just in case the boys needed to come in, and I glanced out the window at the backyard. The tent was still lit up with their flashlights, so I knew they were still awake. It was late for them, but I decided to let it slide since it was a weekend. I went upstairs and got into bed, or shortly after I heard the back door open. My first thought was that one of the boys needed something. A moment later, my younger son came into my room looking scared. He said there was a man in the backyard. I sat up more annoyed than worried, thinking it was just their imagination running, while I told him to stay in the house and went downstairs to check it out for myself. When I stepped outside, I didn't see anything at first. The yard was dark, especially on the far end away from the house where the tent was. But then I turned on the bright outdoor lights, and I noticed a figure standing near the fence, facing away from me. It was too dark for me to make out any details, but there was definitely somebody there. Quietly walked over to the fence and told the boys to get into the house immediately. They scrambled out of the tent and ran inside. They were clearly frightened with the boys safely inside. I looked back to the man by the fence. I called out to him, telling him to leave. But he didn't respond or move. He just stood there completely still. I then grabbed my phone and dialed 911 because I didn't know what the guy would do. They told me that officers were on the way, so I just waited. While I was there waiting for the police to arrive, I kept my eyes on the man remain still. It was a tense few minutes, but my wife was inside with the boys, so I knew they were safe. Then I saw a police car pull up to the house. Two officers came over, and I pointed them towards where the man was by the fence. They called out to him, but he still didn't respond. Then they both approached him while I stayed back. They managed to get him to turn around and walk away without any resistance. It was a relief to see the whole thing being handled. The officers tried talking to him, but it didn't seem like they were getting any response. They then guided him towards their car. As the officers led the man away, they passed by the bright lights on our house. For the first time, I got a clear look at the man. I noticed that he looked disoriented and unsteady on his feet. And I saw his eyes were glazed over. It was clear that he was under the influence of something. They got him into the back of a police car, and one of the officers came over to talk to me. That was it for the night. The cops took off with a man, and then I went back into the house. The kids stayed inside that night, and the next day, I went out to take down the tent. In the light of the day, I took a look around to the spa where the man was standing. There were some scratch marks on the wood of the fence. I then noticed that there was a small knife on the ground next to the fence among the long grass. Somehow the cops missed it. I looked at where it was and then called the police to let him know. When they came back, they told me that the man lived only a few houses down in the basement apartment of one of the houses. I was surprised because I had never seen him before. The creepiest part was that he was back in our neighborhood afterwards. He wasn't charged with anything serious, so we were stuck with him. About a year later, he moved out. But until then, we were cautious about letting the boys out alone. This story takes place about 10 years ago, when I was still living with my parents. I'm 25 now, so I guess I was 15. We lived in a fairly poor neighborhood that was on a busy street in our town. Wasn't the safest place, and my parents never let me stay out after dark when I was younger. Since I was getting older, though, the rules were a little more relaxed, and I still need to be careful at night. Our street was lined with rundown old houses, ours being one of them. And everyone knew that one of them was a drug house. It was a constant source of trouble. We tried to stay out of their way. You would see strange people walking around, especially late at night. The cops were there at least once a week, and I'd be woken up by sirens occasionally although I'm not sure if that was always their fault. Our house was an old red brick mansion that was divided up into apartments. We were on the second floor with a view of the street from the kitchen window. Outside that window was a metal ladder that was supposed to be a fire escape. There was also a small metal balcony right there, but we never used it. My bedroom was at the back of the house, with my window facing a brick wall. So I kept the curtains closed most of the time. There was a short hallway with the two bedrooms. It was just between the living room and the kitchen. With my door open, I can see most of the apartment. My parents were both teachers, so they both had regular schedules and were always home in the evenings. Most of my friends had parents who worked strange hours and were never home. I used to be jealous of that because they could do whatever they wanted. Now I know that I was the lucky one, especially because of what happened in this story. One day, we were all at home. My parents were watching TV in the living room, and I was in my bedroom doing homework. It was quiet except for the muffled sound of the TV from the other room. Suddenly, I heard a noise, and it sounded like glass breaking. Honestly, at the time, I thought it was a gunshot. But looking back, I know there was no bag, just shattered glass. I got up and went to my bedroom door to check what it was. As soon as it opened, I saw my dad from behind. He was standing in the kitchen. I was pretty sure that was where the noise came from. Somebody had definitely broken the window. I knew that right away. Then my mom came over to me, tried to push me back into my room. I resisted a little because I was curious that my dad turned around and whispered for me to stay back and moved a little into my room, but kept the door cracked so I could see. As I was standing there, a man stumbled into my view. He looked frantic and disheveled. Clearly one of the people from the drug house even recognized me because he'd been around before. My heart pounded as I watched him from the doorway, and I was trying to stay hidden. I knew we were in danger, and I didn't know what he would do next. My dad stepped forward and said, "What do you want?" I could tell that he was trying to stay calm. The man was shaking and glanced around the kitchen. He was mumbling incoherently. What really worried me was that he sounded scared. Imagine that some guy breaks into your house. Then he's the one who's scared. My mom edged closer to me with a phone in her hand. I didn't see her do it, but I know now that she had already called the police. And I heard my dad asked him calmly again to leave. The man didn't seem to hear. He was breathing heavily, clearly desperate, took a few steps towards us, and I felt a surge of fear. My dad raised his hands, trying to placate him. "You need to go," he said firmly. "We don't want any trouble." For a moment, the man just stood there looking like he might argue. But then he stopped. He looked at the kitchen window where he came from and back at us, and he finally mumbled, "I'm leaving." He backed away, slowly. We stayed still until he was out the window. My dad quickly closed the curtains behind him. I guess, just to hide the mess from me. There was glass all over the floor, and I could see my dad trying to avoid stepping in it. When the police got there, they talked to my dad for Weir while I was in my room by that time, so I didn't hear most of it. I'm sure my dad knew the guy as well, so he must have told them exactly where he was. When the cops left, I'm sure they would just go over there and pick them up since they knew where he lived. I went to bed that night feeling uncomfortable. The noise from the street was loud because the broken window, I could hear it all the way from my room. It was a reminder of what happened earlier. I felt vulnerable with that window missing. We didn't have anywhere else to go, especially that late at night. I don't remember when I fell asleep. But in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake. When both my parents rushed into my bedroom. My mom came to me, but my dad stayed in front of the door blocking it. I knew right away that somebody had broken in again, probably through that same window. We could hear somebody stomping around through the living room and the kitchen, but he never tried to come into my room. We waited for a few minutes before it sounded like he was gone. My mom had already called the cops again, and they were back in no time. Later that night, I found out that some of our stuff was stolen. Notably, her TV was missing. But I would later find out that it was smashed on the ground outside our fire escape, probably dropped it on his way down. After that, we basically huddled together for the rest of the night until morning. The next day, my parents had the window fixed. The landlord had metal bars put onto all the windows in the house as well. It was good to have that. I was freaked out for a long time afterwards. As for the guy who broke in, he was arrested. We actually never saw him again. I assume he did some time for what he did to us, or for whatever reason you never came back. Maybe he wasn't allowed. That was pretty much. We were broken into twice in the same night by the same crazy neighbor of ours. I lived at that place with my parents for a few more years for getting my own place and moved out shortly after to get a smaller apartment since it was just the two of them. Their new place is in a good neighborhood, and it seems a lot safer. So I'm happy about that. I grew up in a normal suburban neighborhood with my parents and my little sister. We got a house in a newer subdivision that was on a corner lot. There wasn't a lot of space there. So we didn't have much of a yard, but all the houses had a 2-car garage. Since my parents only had 1 car, that's where I kept my bike and other toys. We had some friendly neighbors, and the kids in the area often played together. My sister Emily and I spent a lot of time riding our bikes around the block. We would also play in the park and visit friends. We're only 1 year apart. And even though we argued, sometimes we hung out together too. I think I was 14 when this happened, and she was 13. We knew almost everyone on our block by name, especially the ones who had kids our age. Because of that, felt like a safe place to grow up. There was one exception, though. There was a guy who lived a few houses down from us, and he was pretty creepy. His name was Jimmy, and he was a single guy in his 40s, who lived alone. There were a few incidents prior to this that made me think he was creepy. One night, me and my sister were home alone. We saw him in front of our house pacing back and forth on the street. One time when I looked out, I saw him looking into our window. I closed the curtains and tried to ignore it. When my parents got home, I told them. They told us to avoid them as much as possible. Another time, I was wandering around the neighborhood on a Saturday night with some of my friends. We were hanging out in the park near the woods. There was a swing set and a jungle gym there. But we were just hanging out there after dark. It was about 10 that night when we saw a man approaching us from the distance. We didn't know at the time, but it was Jimmy. When he got close, we took off because we thought it was some adult coming to get us in trouble. We ducked into the woods to get away, but he followed. One of my friends was kind of slow, so he eventually got really close to us. That was when we saw that it was Jimmy. We eventually got back up to the street and lost, and we went to one of my friend's houses and stayed there for a while. I know it sounds like it could be nothing. But in context, that experience will seem a lot creepier. Around that time, one of my neighbors reported a robbery. We didn't know those people well, because they were an old couple who kept to themselves. Everyone at school was told about it. We had to be careful. As I heard it, a couple heard a noise in the middle of the night when they went to check on it. They heard somebody running away and out the front door. When they checked the house, there was no sign of forced entry. So they didn't know how we got in later that week, and went to the garage to get my bike to meet up with my friends. But when I got there, it was gone. At first, I thought maybe my dad moved. But after searching the entire garage, still wasn't there. Then I asked my parents. They didn't know what could have happened. It was clear that my bike had been stolen. And I thought it was another break, but my parents didn't believe it. They thought I must have left it somewhere and forgot. But I knew that wasn't true. As the days went by, we heard more stories from our neighbors. There were also some packages that went missing from porches around that time. Became clear that there was somebody who was stealing from everyone. My friends and I started talking about it at school. We all thought it was Jimmy. Every time I passed his house, felt a chill run down my spine. A few weeks went by and the break-ins were still happening, but were growing more anxious. One evening, when I was riding my friend's bike around the block, I noticed that Jimmy's garage door was slightly open. I slowed down and glanced inside, trying to see if anything looked suspicious. I saw various items piled up. It was hard to make out what it was from the street. I circled around, passed again on the closer side of the street. Just as I was passing, the large sliding door was about halfway closed. It was a mess in there. But I thought I saw my bike for a split second. That was when I became convinced that he was the one behind the whole thing. The next day, I talked to my friend Alex about what I saw. He agreed that the guy was creepy and odd, but didn't really want to get involved. I wouldn't let it go though. And eventually he agreed to help me. We came up with a plan to sneak into the garage and settle the once and for all. It was risky, but it felt like the only way to get any real answers. Cops weren't doing anything anyway. That night after my parents went to bed, I slipped out of the house and met Alex on the corner. Then we made our way to Jimmy's house. The street was mostly dark, but we found our way there anyway. When we reached his garage, we walked around to the side where there was a small window. The garage was attached to the house. So we were worried about making noise. There was a screen on the outside of the window, and it came off easily. And I pushed the glass up using just the friction from my hand. Luckily, it was unlocked. Otherwise, I don't know what I would have done. We wouldn't have broken it. I opened it just enough to slip inside. I got in, it was almost entirely dark. So we took out our phone lights. There were a bit too much. So we turned them off and just used the regular screen light. Instead, we tiptoed around trying to make as little noise as possible, because we were both scared of getting caught. We walked around for a while. And then finally in the front corner of the garage, near the door, I spotted that it was my bike and it was lying on its side. I looked and I quickly grabbed it and moved through the window. I was hoping we could get it out of the way we can. We needed to get out of there before anybody noticed us. Just as we were about to leave, we heard a noise from the inside of the house. Our heart stopped. We froze. Somebody was coming for the garage. We made our way back to the small window, but left my bike behind. Alex went out first, but before I left, I snapped a quick picture of my bike to use as proof for later. I still don't know if I wanted to admit to breaking in it. It was better to have it just in case. We managed to get out. We ran as fast as we could back to our houses. I got home without being noticed. And as far as I knew, sort of my friend. The next day, I tried to tell my parents that Jimmy was behind it all. My mom asked me how I knew when I lied and said that I saw when I was passing by. That was partially true. So it was a good lie. But I didn't tell her that I had the picture. That day, my mom called the cops because of what I said. Because I later heard, the police came and spoke with Jimmy. He even allowed them to search his garage when my bike was never found. I was later told that he consented to a full search of the house, and they found nothing. Looking back, I know that he knew somebody was there, because the bike was obviously moved, must have gotten rid of it. After that happened, we knew that one of our neighbors was breaking into houses, but we couldn't do anything about it. It was weird living around there for the next few years. Jimmy passed away eventually, but I still never got my bike back.